While other bosses played gangster, he played chess. While they chased headlines, he chased silence. And when the feds came for him, they found a ghost who had learned every lesson the dead never could. In 1939, in South Philadelphia, a neighborhood where Italian traditions mixed with American ambition and criminal opportunity, Joseph Anthony Ligambi was born into a world already controlled by shadows. South Philly wasn't just a place. It was a state of mind, a culture, a way of life. The row houses stood shoulder to shoulder like soldiers. The markets sold produce and secrets in equal measure. And everyone knew everyone's business, or pretended they didn't. The Ligambi name had weight in South Philly. Joe's uncle was a made man in the Philadelphia crime family, one of the oldest and most violent mob organizations in America. Growing up, young Joe watched how respect was earned and maintained, through violence when necessary, but more often through reputation, relationships, and the understanding that some debts never expire. South Philadelphia in the 1940s and 50s was mob territory. The Angelo Bruno family, named after its longtime boss, controlled everything that mattered. The numbers rackets, the bookmaking operations, the loan sharking, the labor unions, the politicians. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated millions while maintaining a relatively low profile. Bruno believed in making money, not headlines. Violence was a tool, not a calling card. Young Joe absorbed these lessons. He watched the neighborhood wise guys operate. The subtle nods that meant more than words, the envelopes that changed hands in restaurants, the way disputes got settled without police ever knowing there was a problem. This was the education no school could provide, and Joe was an excellent student. By his teenage years, Joe was already connected. He ran errands for made men, learned the fundamentals of street operations, and proved himself reliable. In the mob, reliability mattered more than flash. A guy who did what he was told, kept his mouth shut, and earned consistently was worth 10 loud mouths who attracted attention. Joe came of age during Philadelphia's golden era of organized crime, the reign of Angelo Bruno, who ruled from 1959 to 1980. Bruno was nicknamed the Gentle Don or the Docile Don, not because he was soft but because he understood that excessive violence brought heat. He built an empire on steady income from traditional rackets while avoiding the spectacular violence that attracted federal attention. Under Bruno, the Philadelphia family prospered quietly. They controlled the waterfront, infiltrated labor unions, ran gambling operations across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and maintained peace with New York's 5 families through respect and cooperation. Bruno was old school. He believed in the commission, respected territorial boundaries, and settled disputes through negotiation rather than bloodshed when possible. Joe Ligambi thrived in this environment. He wasn't a flashy guy, wasn't looking to make a name through violence or bold scores. He was a grinder, someone who showed up every day, did the work, earned his money, and kept his profile low. He ran a bookmaking operation, collected from loan sharking customers, and moved up through the ranks by being competent and reliable. In 1977, Joe was formally inducted into the Philadelphia crime family as a made man. The ceremony was traditional. The pricked finger, the burning saint card, the oath of omerta. Joe swore loyalty to the family above all else, including his own blood relatives. In return, he gained the protection and earning power that came with being a full member of La Cosa Nostra. But Joe's timing was both fortunate and cursed. He became made just as the Philadelphia family's golden age was ending. Bruno's style of quiet leadership had kept the peace for 2 decades, but younger members were getting restless. They saw the money being made in New York, the power that came from being aggressive, and they wanted more. Bruno, in his 70s and set in his ways, refused to adapt. The storm was coming, and Joe, still just a soldier trying to earn, would get caught in it. On March 21, 1980, Angelo Bruno was shot in the back of the head while sitting in a car outside his home. The assassination shattered 2 decades of stability and triggered a war that would devastate the Philadelphia family for years. The killing was authorized by New York's Genovese family, working with ambitious Philadelphia members who wanted change. What followed was chaos. Philip "Chicken Man" Testa took over as boss, but within a year he was dead, killed by a nail bomb planted under his porch. Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo seized power next, and under his leadership, the family descended into madness. Scarfo was everything Bruno wasn't: violent, paranoid, impulsive, and hungry for headlines. Bodies dropped constantly, members got killed over minor slights, and the organization that had operated like a business became a murder factory. Joe Ligambi survived by keeping his head down. While ambitious guys made plays for power and got killed, while captains challenged Scarfo and disappeared, Joe just did his job. He ran his operations, paid his tribute, avoided internal politics, and stayed alive. In an era when being noticed by Scarfo could mean death, invisibility was the best strategy. But even Joe couldn't completely avoid the violence. In 1985, the feds arrested him on murder charges connected to the family's activities. The case was part of a massive RICO prosecution targeting Scarfo and his entire administration. Joe went to trial, fought the charges, and beat them. He was acquitted. It was a narrow escape, a reminder that even doing everything right didn't guarantee survival in Scarfo's Philadelphia. The body count kept rising. Between 1980 and 1990, the Philadelphia family lost dozens of members to internal violence. Scarfo had guys killed for showing disrespect, for earning too much, for not earning enough, for looking at him wrong. It was pathological, and it was destroying the organization. Captains started cooperating with the feds just to survive, and the family that had once been a model of mob discipline became a case study in self-destruction. In 1988, Scarfo's reign finally ended. He was convicted on multiple murder and racketeering charges and sentenced to 55 years in federal prison. His underboss, his consigliere, and most of his administration went down with him. The Philadelphia family was decimated. Most of the leadership was dead or imprisoned, the younger generation was traumatized or cooperating, and the operations that had generated millions were in ruins. John Stanfa, a Sicilian-born mobster, took over as boss with the commission's blessing. But Stanfa was an outsider, not raised in South Philadelphia's mob culture, and he never commanded respect. His reign triggered another war as Young Turks led by Joey Merlino challenged his authority. More bodies dropped, more indictments followed, and the Philadelphia family continued its spiral. Through all this chaos, Joe Ligambi remained a steady presence. He wasn't making plays for leadership, wasn't involved in the wars, wasn't attracting attention. He was just earning, maintaining his operations, and waiting for sanity to return. This patience would prove to be Joe's greatest asset. He was learning from everyone else's mistakes. Joe watched Scarfo's paranoid violence destroy the family. He watched Stanfa's inability to connect with South Philly guys doom his leadership. He watched Joey Merlino's flashy, celebrity gangster style attract federal attention that would eventually send Merlino to prison. Joe was taking notes, building a blueprint for how to lead, whenever his time came. That time would come sooner than anyone expected. By 1999, the Philadelphia family was in shambles. Merlino was heading to prison on racketeering charges. Most of the active leadership was either imprisoned or under indictment, and the family needed someone to hold things together. That someone was Joe Ligambi. Joe was 60 years old, older than most guys who take over as boss. But age was an advantage. He had seen everything, survived everything, and learned from everyone's mistakes. He had no illusions about the life, no romantic notions about being a gangster. He understood that in the modern era, being a mob boss meant managing a declining organization while trying to avoid federal prosecution. Joe's approach to leadership was revolutionary for Philadelphia. After years of flashy, violent, headline-grabbing bosses, Joe went in the opposite direction. He kept an incredibly low profile, avoided unnecessary violence, focused on traditional money-making operations, and stayed as far from law enforcement radar as possible. He didn't hold court in social clubs where FBI cameras could photograph everyone coming and going. He didn't dress in expensive suits that screamed, "Mob Boss." He didn't give interviews or seek attention. Instead, Joe operated like a ghost. He communicated through trusted intermediaries, held meetings in places that changed constantly, never discussed business on phones, and maintained layers of insulation between himself and actual crimes. He learned from the downfall of John Gotti and other celebrity gangsters. Fame was poison, and the smart boss was the one nobody knew about. Under Joe's leadership, the Philadelphia family began to stabilize. The violence decreased dramatically. Joe understood that every body brought FBI attention and made members flip. He settled disputes through mediation, enforced discipline without excessive violence, and rebuilt the family's operations around low-risk, steady-income rackets. Joe's Philadelphia was built on fundamentals: bookmaking, loan sharking, sports betting, illegal video poker machines, and union-connected construction and labor rackets. These weren't exciting crimes, but they generated consistent revenue with manageable risk. Joe understood that the days of mob families controlling entire industries were over. Federal oversight was too sophisticated, RICO prosecutions too effective. The goal now was survival and steady income, not empire building. Joe ran the family like a business because that's what it was. Members had territories where they could earn, but they paid tribute up the chain. Disputes were resolved through sit-downs, not shootouts. Members who brought heat through stupid crimes or unnecessary violence were sanctioned or removed. The organization functioned efficiently because Joe demanded competence and discipline. He also maintained the family's connections to legitimate businesses and labor unions. The Philadelphia family still had influence in construction, waste management, and various unions. Not the stranglehold they'd once had, but enough to generate income and provide cover for operations. Joe understood that mob power in the modern era came from being embedded in legitimate society, not separate from it. This approach extended to relationships with other families. Joe maintained good relations with New York families, particularly the Genovese family, which had historically been close to Philadelphia. He attended commission meetings when necessary, settled inter-family disputes diplomatically, and avoided conflicts that could trigger wars. He understood that every family was under pressure, and cooperation benefited everyone more than competition. Joe's nickname became Uncle Joe, a term of respect that reflected his role as a patriarch rather than a tyrant. Members came to him with problems, and he'd listen, offer advice, and make decisions that balanced fairness with the family's interests. He wasn't trying to be feared. He was trying to be respected and effective. Joe's low-profile strategy worked, for a while. The FBI knew he was running the Philadelphia family, but proving it was difficult. Traditional surveillance methods yielded little useful intelligence. Joe rarely appeared at locations under observation, almost never discussed business on phones, and maintained such tight operational security that even cooperating witnesses couldn't provide substantial evidence against him. But the FBI was patient. They knew Joe was boss, and they were building a case brick by brick. They cultivated informants within the family, placed wiretaps on members' phones hoping to catch Joe's voice, followed money trails connecting criminal proceeds to legitimate businesses. It was slow work, but RICO cases always were. What frustrated the FBI was that Joe's Philadelphia family was nothing like the violent, chaotic organization they dismantled under Scarfo and Merlino. There were no bodies dropping, no spectacular crimes making headlines, no flashy mobsters giving them easy targets. Joe was running a relatively quiet criminal organization that generated income without generating the kind of evidence that made RICO cases easy to prosecute. This created a bureaucratic problem for law enforcement. Federal resources are limited, and prosecutors prioritize cases that will make headlines and justify budgets. A quiet mob family that wasn't killing people or moving tons of narcotics wasn't as sexy as international terrorists or major drug cartels. Joe's strategy of being boring was actually protecting him. But the FBI never gives up on mob bosses. They kept watching, kept investigating, kept building their case. And they knew that eventually everyone makes a mistake. Throughout the 2000s, Joe maintained his low profile while the Philadelphia family continued operating. Members ran their rackets, collected their earnings, and paid tribute up the chain. The organization wasn't making the millions it had in Bruno's era, but it was surviving, which in the post-RICO world was itself an accomplishment. Joe dealt with the challenges every modern mob boss faces. Younger members didn't always understand or respect the old ways. They wanted to make scores, deal powder or crystal for quick money, and operate like the gangsters they saw in movies. Joe had to educate them about why those approaches brought heat, why discipline mattered, why boring and safe was better than exciting and imprisoned. He also managed relationships with older members. Guys who remembered the Bruno era and thought the family should operate more traditionally, who resented changes in how things worked, who sometimes challenged Joe's authority through subtle resistance. Joe balanced these competing interests through a combination of respect for tradition and pragmatic adaptation to reality. The family still had its tensions. A crew in Newark, New Jersey, traditionally under Philadelphia's control, wanted more autonomy. Some captains in South Philly felt they weren't getting enough territory or respect. Young guys ambitious for advancement sometimes pushed boundaries. Joe mediated these disputes, made adjustments when necessary, and enforced decisions when mediation failed. But unlike previous bosses, he used violence as a last resort rather than a first response. This measured approach kept the family together and relatively peaceful. Members might grumble about decisions or feel frustrated by restrictions, but they stayed loyal because Joe was fair, and the alternative, chaos like the Scarfo years, was worse than any complaint about current leadership. In May 2011, the hammer finally dropped. Federal prosecutors unsealed indictments against Joe Ligambi and over a dozen members and associates of the Philadelphia crime family. The charges were massive: racketeering, illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and conspiracy. The government alleged that Joe was the boss of a criminal enterprise that had generated millions through illegal operations across Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The indictment shocked people familiar with Joe's low profile. He had gone years without significant legal trouble, had operated so quietly that many people thought he'd retired or that the Philadelphia family was defunct. But the feds had been working the whole time, and now they were ready to present their case. The evidence was extensive. Cooperating witnesses testified about Joe's role as boss, about how orders flowed through the organization, about meetings where decisions were made. Wiretaps captured conversations between members discussing operations and mentioning Joe's authority. Financial records showed money moving through businesses connected to the family. The feds had built a comprehensive RICO case designed to prove Joe ran a criminal enterprise. Joe was arrested quietly. No dramatic raid, no SWAT team, just federal agents picking him up and taking him into custody. At 72 years old, Joe faced charges that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. The government wanted to make an example of him, to prove that even smart, careful mob bosses eventually get caught. But Joe had one advantage many defendants don't have. He was genuinely liked and respected, even by some law enforcement officials who grudgingly admitted he'd run a relatively peaceful organization. This respect wouldn't get him acquitted, but it might influence sentencing if he was convicted. Joe's defense strategy was simple: deny, deny, deny. His attorneys argued that Joe was a legitimate businessman who ran a pizzeria and other legal enterprises. Yes, he knew people who were criminals, that's unavoidable in South Philadelphia. But he wasn't a mob boss, wasn't running criminal operations, and wasn't guilty of the charges against him. The defense attacked the credibility of cooperating witnesses, pointing out that they were admitted criminals testifying to reduce their own sentences. They challenged the wiretap evidence, arguing that conversations were taken out of context and didn't prove criminal enterprise. They presented Joe as a 72-year-old man being persecuted because of his last name and his neighborhood. The trial was intense, lasting weeks and involving dozens of witnesses and thousands of pages of evidence. Prosecutors painted Joe as a cunning mob boss who had successfully avoided detection for years through careful operational security. The defense portrayed him as a businessman caught up in guilt by association. Jurors heard about the Philadelphia family's history, the violence of the Scarfo years, the chaos of the Stanfa and Merlino eras. They heard cooperating witnesses describe how the organization worked, how Joe made decisions, how money flowed through the system. They heard wiretaps where members discussed operations, though Joe himself was rarely captured on recordings. The prosecution's case was strong but not overwhelming. They had circumstantial evidence, testimony from criminals, and financial records. But they didn't have recordings of Joe directly ordering crimes or engaging in criminal activity. This would prove crucial. In 2014, after years of legal battles and a lengthy trial, the jury returned its verdict. On the most serious charge, being the boss of a criminal enterprise, Joe was acquitted. Not guilty. The government had failed to prove that Joe ran the Philadelphia crime family. It was a stunning defeat for federal prosecutors who had spent years building their case. The jury believed that while Joe certainly knew criminals and may have been involved in some illegal activities, The government hadn't proven beyond reasonable doubt that he was the boss of an organized crime family. The evidence was insufficient, the witnesses were questionable, and the case had reasonable doubt. Joe was convicted on some lesser charges, conspiracy to participate in illegal gambling operations, but was acquitted of the racketeering conspiracy and most of the serious counts. The verdict meant Joe would face some prison time, but nothing like the decades prosecutors had sought. The acquittal sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the criminal underworld. It was rare for an alleged mob boss to beat the main charges in a RICO case. The government usually wins these prosecutions. They have unlimited resources, sophisticated investigative tools, and decades of experience prosecuting organized crime. But Joe had been careful enough, quiet enough, and smart enough that the jury wasn't convinced. In 2015, Joe was sentenced to just 2 years in prison for the gambling charges, a fraction of what prosecutors had sought. For a 76-year-old alleged mob boss facing a massive RICO prosecution, 2 years was essentially a victory. Joe would serve his time and walk out, having beaten the worst charges and survived what should have been a life sentence. Joe served his sentence at a federal correctional facility, and by all accounts, he did his time quietly. No problems, no drama, no attempts to run operations from inside. He was an old man serving a short sentence, and he understood that the smart play was to stay quiet, do the time, and get out. During those 2 years, Joe had plenty of time to reflect on his life and career. He had survived decades in a world where most people die young or die in prison. He'd navigated the violent Scarfo years, outlasted multiple bosses, ran the family for over a decade, and beaten a massive federal prosecution. By any measure, Joe's career was a success, at least in terms of mob careers where success means staying alive and free. But Joe also understood that the world he'd known was dying. The Philadelphia family he'd led was a shadow of what it had been. Most of the old members were dead or imprisoned, the young guys were less committed to the life, and traditional mob operations were increasingly difficult to sustain. Federal oversight was too sophisticated, cooperation too common, and the social structures that had supported mob culture were eroding. Joe was released in 2016 after serving his 2-year sentence. He was 77 years old, forbidden from associating with known criminals, required to report regularly to parole officers, and under FBI surveillance. But he was free, and given what could have happened, freedom at 77 was more than most mob bosses ever get. Joe returned to South Philadelphia, the neighborhood he'd never really left even during his years running the family. He went back to living quietly, running his legitimate businesses, and staying away from anything that might bring him back to federal attention. The conditions of his supervised release were strict. Any violation could send him back to prison, and at his age, even a short sentence could be a death sentence. The Philadelphia family he'd once led was barely functional. Leadership had passed to others. Some say Joseph "Mousy" Massimino took over, though the family structure had become so loose that traditional hierarchies meant less than they used to. The organization still existed, still had members, still ran some operations, but it was operating at a fraction of its former capacity, more a social club with criminal elements than a criminal enterprise with social elements. Joe had no official role anymore, even if he'd wanted to stay involved, and there's no evidence he did. His supervised release forbade it, and the FBI watched for any sign of renewed criminal activity. Joe was effectively retired, spending his time with family, managing his legitimate businesses, and living out whatever years remained in peace. But in South Philadelphia, Joe Ligambi's reputation endured. He was the boss who'd stabilized the family after years of chaos, who'd kept people alive when previous bosses got them killed, who'd beaten a massive federal prosecution and walked out of prison. Among the old-timers and those who understood the life, Joe was respected. Not feared, but genuinely respected for competence, fairness, and survival. Joe Ligambi's career offers a blueprint for how to run a mob family in the modern era. Every lesson he learned was purchased with other people's blood and freedom. Joe watched bosses make mistakes and then did the opposite. Lesson 1. Violence attracts attention. Scarfo killed constantly and destroyed the family. Joe used violence sparingly and kept the organization stable. Lesson 2. Celebrity kills. Merlino loved the spotlight and went to prison. Joe avoided cameras and nearly avoided prosecution entirely. Lesson 3. discipline over chaos. Previous bosses let paranoia or ambition drive decisions. Joe made calculated choices based on what benefited the organization, not his ego. Lesson 4. Adaptation over tradition. Joe understood that the mob couldn't operate like it did in the 1960s. He adapted to modern realities while maintaining core principles. Lesson 5. Respect over fear. Members stayed loyal to Joe not because they were terrified of him, but because he treated them fairly and made smart decisions. These lessons didn't guarantee success. Joe still got indicted, still served time. But they allowed him to survive longer and fare better than almost any other modern mob boss. In an era when bosses typically get life sentences, Joe got 2 years. In a world where most alleged mob bosses die in prison, Joe walked out and went home. The Philadelphia crime family still exists, though barely. It's one of the smallest and weakest of America's traditional mob families, reduced from its peak of hundreds of members and associates to perhaps a few dozen active participants. The operations that once generated millions now generate modest income. The power that once controlled major industries now influences small-time rackets. But survival itself is noteworthy. Many predicted the Philadelphia family would be completely destroyed by the wars of the 1980s and 90s. The organization should have collapsed under the weight of bodies, prosecutions, and betrayals. That it didn't, that it limped into the 21st century and continues existing, is partly due to Joe Ligambi's leadership during a critical period. Joe held the family together when it could have fragmented. He maintained connections to New York families that provided support and legitimacy. He rebuilt operations that generated enough income to keep members fed. He couldn't restore the family to its former glory. Nobody could, but he kept it alive. This is Joe's legacy. Not building an empire, not becoming a legend, but keeping something alive that probably should have died. It's unglamorous, unheroic, and won't be celebrated in movies. But in the context of modern organized crime, where survival is the highest achievement, Joe succeeded where flashier bosses failed. Today, Joe Ligambi is in his mid-80s, living quietly in South Philadelphia, largely forgotten by a world that has moved on from mob stories. He's not in movies, doesn't have books written about him, doesn't have a Wikipedia entry as detailed as flashier gangsters. He's just an old man who once ran a criminal organization, served his time, and lived long enough to see the world change completely. But among those who understand the life, Joe's reputation remains. He's the boss who learned from everyone's mistakes. The guy who survived the Scarfo years. The leader who stabilized Philadelphia. The defendant who beat the Fed's main charges. The old man who walked out of prison and went home. In a world of loud, violent, self-destructive mob bosses, Joe was quiet, controlled, and strategic. He wasn't the most powerful boss, the richest boss, or the most feared boss. But he was smart enough to survive when almost everyone else didn't. And in the mob, survival is the ultimate victory. Joe's story doesn't have the drama of John Gotti's rise and fall. It doesn't have the violence of Nicky Scarfo's reign of terror. It doesn't have the romance of mob legends from cinema. What it has is something rarer and more valuable. A mob boss who played the game smart, minimized casualties, and lived long enough to retire. That's not sexy, but it's real. And in the ruins of what organized crime used to be, Joe Ligambi stands as proof that intelligence, discipline, and patience matter more than flash, violence, and ego. If there's one lesson from Joe Ligambi's life, it's this. The smartest criminals are the ones you never hear about. They don't seek fame, don't court controversy, don't give law enforcement easy targets. They operate in shadows, make money quietly, and avoid the spotlight that destroys everyone it touches. Joe understood what John Gotti, Nicky Scarfo, Joey Merlino, and countless others never grasped. Being a celebrity gangster is a death sentence. The media loves a colorful mob boss, but every headline is ammunition for prosecutors. Every photo is evidence, every quote is potential testimony. The bosses who survive are the ones who bore people, who operate so quietly that even dedicated FBI agents struggle to build cases. Joe nearly succeeded completely. He ran Philadelphia for over a decade with minimal violence, stable operations, and almost no federal attention. His eventual prosecution resulted in mostly acquittals and a sentence he survived easily. Compare that to bosses who got multiple life sentences, died in prison, or got killed by their own members. Joe Ligambi won't be remembered like Al Capone or Lucky Luciano. He won't have Hollywood movies made about his life. He won't be cited as a symbol of organized crime's golden age. But he'll live out his final years in his own home, in his own neighborhood, as a free man. And for a mob boss in the 21st century, that's the closest thing to a happy ending that exists. They say the last king of a dead empire is a fool. But Joe Ligambi wasn't a king. He was a caretaker. He didn't build an empire. He just kept the ruins standing long enough to walk away. And in a world where mob bosses die in cages or coffins, Uncle Joe went home. The gentleman who ruled nothing survived everything, and proved that the quietest man in the room is the one they can never quite catch.